Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Oliveros. I'm with the IFRC Global Cash team based in Geneva. I'm responsible for cash innovations. Welcome to our webinar today on digital identities and humanitarian action. Late last year, the IFRC commissioned 2 research papers to identify the opportunities and risks of digital IDs. One was led by the Oxford Center for Technology and Development, which looked at and analyzed the interest, considerations, and piloting of digital ID in the broader humanitarian sector, including cash and voucher assistance. 24 individuals were consulted representing humanitarian organizations, including national societies looking into digital ID solutions, donors, and private sector experts. The report will have 3 case studies on how humanitarian organizations have implemented digital ID in their work. The second research was led by our IFRC consultant, which has specifically looked at digital IDs in a migration context. Over 80 migration experts and those involved in migration activities were consulted representing 27 organizations. Stakeholders included national societies, NGOs, and UN partners, private sector, and donors as well. These reports are being finalized now and will be published by the end of this month or early May. We're excited to have the researchers with us today to give a preview of their findings and observations. These reports are being supported by our Dignified Identities and Cash Assistance project, or DIGID for short. We have a consortium that governs the project and overall learning, and this consortium is comprised of the Norwegian Red Cross, Norwegian Refugee Council, Norwegian Church Aid, and Save the Children Norway, with the IFRC as a technical implementation lead. The DIGID project is also supported by Innovation Norway. For more information on the DIGID project and learning so far, please visit the website shown here. Before we hear from our panel, I want to help set the scene for why this topic is important. Everyone has an identity, but not everyone is able to prove themselves. The World Bank estimates over 1 billion people with no recognized IDs, and this prevents them from accessing certain services such as education and employment. From a humanitarian standpoint, people with no recognized ID or may have lost them due to disasters and conflict have challenges receiving assistance. The 2018 World Disaster Report highlighted that people who are unable to prove their identities or eligibility can render entire communities invisible. They are left behind, further increasing their vulnerabilities. You can see some of the challenges here in this slide, which we will visit during our panel discussion today. But the main question here that we're trying to answer is, how do we enable efficient and effective humanitarian assistance with a fundamental issue as identity? We believe that collaboration and learning from each other in this sector is key in finding answers. And this is one of the reasons why the DIGID project is doing this with a consortium. And we would like to reach out to those interested in working with us on this important topic so we can collectively address the issues and not further create silos. I'll now welcome our moderator for today, Jenny Gilbertson, who is the Innovations Coordinator at the Norwegian Red Cross. And if you have any questions during the panel discussion, please don't hesitate to use the chat window. We will try to answer some questions at the end. And if we run out of time, we will provide written responses after the session with a link to the recording of this event. Thank you, and over to you, Jenny.
Thank you so much, Joseph, and welcome to everyone today to this session. I think it's probably many time zones, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of those joining. Really pleased to have 2 panelists today talking about their research. So as introduction, first panelist is Zisky Putz. Zisky is a graduate student and researcher at the Oxford Center for Technology and Development and has been the consultant driving one of the papers that Joseph mentioned. And our other panelist today is Nadia Curry. She is formerly the IFRC operations manager for the Columbia Migration emergency appeal, and has just completed this consultancy on migration and digital identity. So welcome to Nadia. So just start, maybe a question for you, Zisky, is, to set the scene, what does digital identity mean for humanitarian actors?
So what we found is that there actually isn't any coherent definition of what digital identity is. It can mean really different things to different organizations and also takes on a variety of forms. So I can talk through some of the examples that we saw. A digital identity can be considered a digital copy of an identity document. So perhaps you've got a passport, you could have that in a digital copy. That would be a really straightforward example. It could also be a set of attributes representing an individual in a given transaction. So some of the common use cases that we see in the humanitarian sector specifically could be digital identities for user registration, for cash transfer and voucher assistance, or thirdly, for identification and even credential logs. Even though there's such a host of forms that they can take, there is some common ground across these use cases. There's almost always a common function or goal. So a digital identity is meant to be a digital way to confirm, as Joseph pointed out, that somebody is who they say they are. And second, there's really common ground in a call to action, where multiple interviewees pointed out to this extreme variability as something that made coordination and collaboration really difficult. So they emphasized the need for these groups to come together and produce a very simple common lexicon of terminology, which I think speaks to and reflects the status of the field of digital identities in the humanitarian space at the moment, which is an incredibly popular, but also very diverse set of tools. And it's a really popular trend that has a lot of power to broaden access to essential resources for those affected and perhaps help them have more control over their personal identification information and also more control over the access to aid and essential resources that they could have in times of volatility.
Thanks, Zisky. You mentioned some different tools. Could you share some examples of solutions which are maybe being piloted or explored right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I can talk through the 3 use cases that we came across in our report. But before I go ahead and do that, I'm just going to throw in a quick caveat for you here. I'm going to focus on humanitarian use cases, but the role of the private sector really is significant in this space in terms of developing the technology that is available and also coming up with the best practices for the use cases in which they can be deployed and perhaps guidelines of how this should be done. So the humanitarian space does have a lot to learn from the private sector, but of course there's very different goals and constraints in mind. So those need to be adapted to humanitarian purposes. With that caveat in mind, I can dive into some of the use cases that we saw. So as I mentioned earlier, one of these is user registration. And the One-to-One Consortium ran a pilot recently in Kenya with the Kenya Red Cross, which piloted an app-based self-registration. So through an audio interface or even an automated WhatsApp-style chat interface, users could register for and be informed about aid programming. Another was a cash transfer platform, which has been running since 2015. It's called Sika, and it's run by World Vision International in Nepal. And in this version, users are registered manually by an organization, so not the same as in the other case. And their phone number is actually what acts as their user identity. And that becomes attached to a digital wallet. And this acts as a space where they can be given and trade tokens with local vendors so that they could purchase goods like bags of rice or something, or they could also be sent these tokens via SMS, so it's text message, and then use those as almost an e-voucher. A third and pretty different version, so this I think gives you a really good overview of just how diverse these use cases can be, is the form of credentials. So Gravity Earth was using a digital wallet to enhance what they called humanitarian coordination. So essentially, this was going to be a decentralized digital location, like your personal file that only the user owns and has control over, in which individuals in Turkey could store their vocational training credentials. So a ton of Turkish government organizations were offering vocational training, and then you get a certificate once you've completed that training. And this is essentially a way for you to have a digital copy of that certificate, own it, and have the opportunity to share it out with local employers. And the key thing here is that you, as the user who attended and completed the training, are fully in control and have the power to share that with whichever employers in the region you're interested in. And the employers in turn can access that and essentially see your training history. A similar thing was being piloted by the Australian Red Cross, where it's this digital wallet or digital file for the user, but in this case, the user were actually humanitarian volunteers, and they could, again, store all of their training credentials on there. But in this case, maybe it would be something like CPR training or credential like that. So overall, we're coming to a point where this technology is starting to explode. There's a ton of different use cases, and there's also a ton of future trends in how people want to be using them. But there's a need for more collaboration so that the organizations who are deploying them can learn from another and can continue to improve the technology, and perhaps more importantly, the frameworks in which it's going to be deployed so that it continues to emphasize user needs and rights regardless of what use case it's being deployed in.
Great. Thanks so much, Siski. Some really interesting examples there. So maybe if we have more time, we can get into them even more. Maybe going over to Nadia now. Curious if you could highlight a few potential benefits of digital identities, maybe both to organizations and to the people whom these organizations attend.
Thanks, Jennifer. Absolutely. So in terms of the people to whom humanitarian organizations attend, and I'll just caveat also to say that I had focused on organizations that work in the migration context. It's a huge number of contexts, but also hugely important given that some 80 million people around the world are estimated as having been forcibly displaced. The first issue is really that it's a protection issue. People who don't have documentation ultimately end up having a lesser access to services. In the interviews that I conducted with field implementers of humanitarian organizations, 62% of them said they couldn't attend to a vulnerable person in the service that was required because they didn't have identification. Now, they could offer them alternative services, but that's a huge percentage of organizations that said at the end of the day, we cannot attend to people with the services that would be ideal for them because they don't have a form of ID. So that would be one of the huge benefits that could be attended through a digital identity, giving people access to services through having some form of documentation that allows them to confirm who they are. And ultimately, a lot of digital identities provide for storage options. And that's another huge advantage for people on the move, that in a digital form, they could have access to certain essential information. It could be training certificates, it could be medical history forms, it could be key numbers of contact persons in case of emergencies. Ultimately, it makes things more accessible to them. Another key benefit for beneficiaries, and in particular people on the move who are attended by various humanitarian organizations, is as they move across countries and across borders, the likelihood is they will come across various humanitarian organizations who hopefully can provide them with some support. Those people generally need to be registered every time that they go to a new humanitarian organization. And for somebody on the move who goes through multiple countries, that's a lengthy process of having to share again and again their personal details, their names, their surnames, their gender, their date of birth, their place of origin. And in the case of people who have gone through protection issues, one example that came up was victims of sexual and gender-based violence, having to share again and again the story and the harm that they've gone through can be very difficult. So having a digital identity would avoid the need for people to have to go through those processes again. Now, in terms of the benefits for the organization, there would be a clear administrative benefit of not having to register people over and over again, particularly if we manage to develop a digital identity that can be shared across different organizations. Then that not only helps to prevent silos, but it also allows us to better coordinate and to ultimately save time. And that means that we can focus more on the quality of attention rather than the time that it takes to register somebody and then point them in the right direction. As aligned to that, there's a huge benefit in terms of costs. As some of our panelists have also mentioned, different organizations have different solutions. Those are costly to roll out, and having a unified solution helps to prevent expenditure in that sense. And then finally, it's hoped that having a digital identity, better coordination across different actors, and better information about the services that may be needed by different people mean that we can more proactively offer services that are more complementary to them, and ultimately improve the quality of service.
Great, thanks, Nadia. No, it's very interesting, of course, to hear all these benefits about, access, and all of us, I think, appreciate having decreased administration. But when we talk about technology in these settings, I think we often recognize where there are benefits, there are also risks. Curious if you can reflect a little bit on the risk side, the other side of the coin.
Sure, there's a huge number of risks, absolutely. So I'll try and limit it to a few as the time is short. So in terms of the organizations, the humanitarian organizations will ultimately implement these solutions. The first one that comes up is data protection compliance. I think there's often a disconnect between what would be ideally implemented from a headquarters perspective and how it ends up being implemented in the field. So that's ultimately a huge risk when we talk about a digital solution that may or may not be understood well by people who use it, and ultimately is a solution of the future. It's still developing, it's going to develop a lot more in the next decades, and trying to plan from now what a data protection framework might be like in a few years ends up being very difficult in terms of compliance. Another big risk for organizations is having requests for access to confidential information. And at the end of the day, there's more and more legislation being passed by national authorities, which allows them greater flexibility and greater powers in accessing information that's personal. So organizations may find themselves in a position where they do have to comply with national law of the country in which they operate and end up disclosing personal data. Otherwise, they may no longer be able to operate. They may face huge fines. And this is something that's increasingly happening from developing legislation. There's another risk in terms of implementation, which is the staff and the training that will be required for these solutions. So any sort of rollout of new solution involves additional costs, training, ensuring that the solution works. And that's another risk in terms of upfront investment for the organization. In terms of the people to whom organizations attend, there's a big risk in terms of providing informed consent. So in the emergency situations, more and more it's being considered that informed consent is neither really informed or neither really consensual, because people come in a situation of need. They may have gone through great trauma, and really they may not be giving as much attention to their privacy rights as to their immediate needs to be satisfied in terms of food, water, shelter, or protection. Another big risk for people to whom we attend is what's often considered as a power asymmetry between the humanitarian organization providing the assistance and the person who ultimately receives it, where they feel that they will have to be in a situation of providing their personal data, whether they like it or not, because they fully understand that in order to obtain a service of humanitarian, to attend to their humanitarian needs, they need to provide that data. And they do also know that they don't really have any choice about it. So that's a difficult one. And in fact, one of the interviewees I spoke to said, collecting all this personal data before we attend to someone is in the end counterintuitive to the humanitarian imperative and to our humanitarian principles. If you think about sitting down somebody and having to collect all this personal data before we can support them in some way with certain services. Finally, one key risk for people to whom we attend, and especially migrants, people on the move, people who may be fleeing their countries for different reasons, is the risk of surveillance and unauthorized access by national authorities. And that's, again, as I mentioned, both for organizations and for individuals, an increasing risk as digital powers are more and more expanded. Ultimately, a key risk, again, is that these solutions shouldn't marginalize people who are already in a vulnerable situation.
Maybe to build on that last point, Nadia, I mean, you mentioned that, many of those that maybe we are trying to attend, and especially maybe in a migration context, which I realize you looked at quite closely, may already face kind of exclusion from technology, from services. How do we make sure that in developing digital identities, we are not further exacerbating that exclusion?
Thanks, Jen. Absolutely. So there's a key aspect, a key approach, which is always important to include in any kind of intervention, which is community engagement, right? So I think whatever solution should ensure that communities are appropriately engaged in all processes and all steps of the processes. I will give you 5 key points in less than 2 minutes, I hope, because we're very short on time. So the first point is access to connectivity and access to devices. So if we're talking about a digital identity, people will probably need, depending on the solution, of course, but people will probably need access to a digital device and access to the internet for it to work. So if people don't have access to those basic elements, it's likely that they may not be able to use a digital identity solution. Secondly, there's issues in terms of literacy and language. Now, that could be alphabetical literacy, and it could also be technological literacy. If people aren't able to use those tools, or if those tools aren't in languages that they can understand and that they can use, then there are challenges. Of course, certain solutions can get around those, but it's very important for those to be considered. Another risk and another key element to be considered in terms of community engagement and inclusion is ensuring that there's appropriate access to information. So if people don't have information about these tools and how they work, then they won't be able to use them. That's quite clear. And depending on how the community works, it may be that information goes to certain members of the community only, not to all of them. That brings me on to the next point of gender and age and other elements of a person that could lead to them being discriminated against or less included. We talk about digital divides. We know that there's a huge digital divide and it tends to affect disproportionately women. There's also an identity divide. The World Bank estimates that in least developed countries, 1 out of 2 women do not have identity, and that's a huge proportion. So it's important that any digital identity solution does have an important gender focus and also an age focus. We all know that our grandparents are less able to use technology than our younger generations. Not in all cases, but it tends to be a generalization. And then finally, in the migration context, when we're thinking about a digital identity solution, it's important to take into account the needs of the host communities who interact around those migrants and ensure that there's no increase in potential tension between migrants and the host communities who receive them. Thank you.
Thanks, Nadia. It's a lot of good points, and I think it really emphasizes the importance of having a human-centered approach to developing all these solutions. As we are quickly approaching the end of this wonderful session, we wanted to make sure to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists as well. At this moment, I'm seeing maybe one comment in the chat. I'm not sure if there's a question in there. Let's see. I think the question is, beyond the issue of data protection, what can we do with the different views from people who help and respect their willingness? Many people on the move do not wish to be traced along the migratory trail until they reach the destination. So maybe I think this is a question for Nadia. Nadia, do you want to respond to this?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for that question. Indeed, part of the issue in terms of traceability and surveillance is that when you use a digital identity, particularly a telephone, there's a risk that people's geolocalization is tracked. And particularly in Europe, certain countries or certain migratory authorities of those countries are known to have taken the telephones of migrants who are applying for asylum and using the metadata of those telephones to check where they have gone along the migratory trail. And that allows them to confirm or not whether the people are eligible for asylum in their country or whether they had previously passed through a safe third country which would have been appropriate for asylum. And on that basis, they may reject their asylum claims. So absolutely, it's a big risk, and it's something that's very important in terms of developing this sorts of solution.
Great, thank you so much for that. If there are any additional questions, maybe it doesn't look like it. Oh, did you come across anything related to fraud risk mitigation in your work? I don't know if maybe Ziski, you want to answer this?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent point. And it certainly is one of the key benefits to organizations when it comes to deploying digital identity solutions. It's the fact that they can really enhance a lot of trust, accountability, and safety, especially if we're talking about something like cash transfers. And particularly when you're dealing with financial institutions, they have KYC requirements, otherwise known as Know Your Customer requirements. And this is something that if you set up the parameters of a digital identity with the needs of these financial actors in mind, then you can almost ensure that users are immediately going to address and meet and satisfy those criteria. So financial actors, perhaps if they see somebody has a migrant background or like a non-super official identification from that particular country in which they're trying to open a bank account, for example, perhaps they would usually be pushed to the side from the financial actor. But if you can make sure that they hit the KYC requirements, then you can open the door for them to actually have the opportunity to start to have greater financial inclusion wherever they currently are. And likewise, on the accountability thread, organizations can then share metadata under specific requirements, of course, that are under data protection guidelines. They could share that metadata so that donors can track and also see patterns, or even the organization itself could start to see patterns in their metadata to make sure that there is no fraud happening within their system.
Thank you so much for that, Ziski. And I see we have more questions coming in from the audience, but unfortunately we have to stick to our time. And so we want to just say, though, that, you know, this is obviously a very big topic that we have been diving into. And we really hope that those who are joining today will continue to engage with us. If this is a topic that you are interested in, if you are interested in learning more about the projects that are ongoing or these research papers, please do reach out to us. We will be sharing our contact information in the chat. Also, just to say that the great research done by Ziski and Nadia are both going to be published very soon. So in the upcoming weeks, these will be able to be disseminated much more widely. So we really hope that you'll be able to read the documents, and that will help spur even more conversations. Also, as Joseph mentioned at the beginning, some of the projects that are ongoing are part of a consortium. And if you're interested in learning kind of about some of the projects that this consortium is working on, we have also pasted the website for that in the chat. So I really want to thank our panelists, Nadia and Ziski, for your time and sharing just even a little bit of the great learnings that you guys did, and to Joseph as the organizer for this session. So hope you all have a really great rest of your data and digital week. And please do reach out. Thank you all so much. Have a really great rest of the day. Bye, everyone.